Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of our Logic 2 video chats on fallacies of clarity. So just to remind you, we are on the final unit of the Larsen textbook, chapter 6, which covers fallacies of clarity. And as a review, fallacies of clarity are informal logical fallacies, so logical fallacies based upon weaknesses in the content of an argument. These are informal logical fallacies that are based upon unclear language in the argument that either weakens the argument or is being used misleadingly to either cover up a weakness in the argument or even deceive the listener, even deceive the hearer of the argument into thinking that one thing has been said when in fact it has not. One thing is being said, but the arguer means another thing entirely. And so last week we discussed and you read about the fallacy of equivocation, the fallacy in which a word with a double meaning is being used as if it only means one thing when that word in fact means several different things. And this week we are talking about accent. So this week's fallacy is the fallacy of accent, also known as the fallacy of emphasis. So when I say accent, there's already some potential equivocation there. Just a little review of last week. That accent has multiple meanings. We hear the word accent, we usually think of accent as in a regional dialect, a regional pattern of speech that tells you where somebody is from. So you know somebody is from Boston when they describe themselves as being wicked smart. Well, we're not talking about that kind of accent today. We're talking about accent as in emphasis, the way that we put stress or emphasis on one particular word or a group of words in a statement and not another. And especially the way that that can be used to change the meaning of what you're saying without changing the words of a statement. You can change what that statement says by putting emphasis on a specific word, on a particular word. So as we think of a couple of examples, of fallacy of accent. Let's imagine a teacher. Let's imagine a teacher is addressing his class. And the teacher says to his class, I would not say that you are a rowdy class. Well, if we take that as a monotone, if we don't put an accent on any particular word, we have a very basic statement that this class is not rowdy. This class is well behaved. This class is easy to call to order. Now, let's play with the accent in the sentence and see if we can change the meaning without changing the words. So let's have the teacher render the statement like this. I wouldn't say that you're a rowdy class. So once again, I wouldn't say that you're a rowdy class. We'll stop and think for a minute. Where did we put the accent? Yes, that's right. We put the accent on the word say. Now, why did that teacher put the accent on the word say? Well, the teacher put the accent on the word say because we know that he means something else. He does not mean to say that the class isn't rowdy. He is, in fact, saying the opposite. He's saying, you are rowdy. I'm not going to say it, but I'm thinking it. Otherwise, why else would you emphasize the say in that sentence? Just like if he said to his class, you are a relatively well-behaved class. Well, we might take that statement at face value and assume that he means the class is well-behaved. But then we have to stop. We have to ask ourselves, why did he put the weasel word relatively into that statement? And then why did he emphasize it? Well, he emphasized it because he's saying they're well-behaved relative to something, and we're supposed to stop and think, relative to what? The meaning of that statement changes depending on what the class's behavior is being compared to. Are they relatively well behaved compared to other excellent classes that teacher has taught? Are they relatively well behaved compared to the animals section at FSU baseball games? Are they relatively well behaved compared to Soccer Riot? it's all dependent upon that relatively, that weasel word with the accent thrown on it. So as we're thinking about fallacy of accent, this shows up in the real world all the time. I can even think of an example that took place in our very own household earlier this week. So if you remember our last class discussion, we paused, we took a break in the discussion to talk about different ways that all of our families are coping, are working with, handling and making the best of the current situation, these sort of self-quarantine, the social distancing. And we mentioned that there seems to be a lot of baking going on. Everyone seems to be baking. All these go on social media, and all you see are these pictures of pies and cakes and cookies and breads, and everyone's baking all of a sudden. Well, our household is no different. And so Mrs. H, out of the generosity of her heart, decided that we needed some kind, she wanted us to have a special dessert after an evening meal. And so prior to going to work at the beginning of the day, Mrs. H had baked a delicious cherry pie from scratch and then left it on the kitchen counter and went to work, assuming that myself and the children would understand this was meant to be the evening dessert and that we should therefore leave it alone, demonstrating a much higher opinion of us than we deserved. And as Mrs. H came home to the predictable results and surveyed the wreckage, she wanted to know of me, why did we eat all the pie? To which I responded with what I realized later was the fallacy of accent. My response, which I'm not proud of, was, well, we didn't eat the whole pie. And you see the accent in that sentence. We didn't eat the whole pie. Why did I say the whole pie, and why did I put the accent on whole? Well, if we take that statement at face value, we didn't eat the whole pie. It implies that part of the pie was left over. It implies that we thought about saving some pie for later, saving some pie for dessert after supper, and that therefore we exercised self-control and admirable restraint. When in fact, what I had been using that word whole to imply was I was using the fact that we did not, in fact, eat every single piece of pie. We did not eat every pie molecule. There was one sad square-inch corner of pie crust corner angled laying on the bottom of the pie plate surrounded by crumbs, and therefore we did not eat the whole pie. So really this was covering up our greed and trying to mislead and make it sound like we were more self-controlled than we in fact were. So there's the fallacy of accent. Now, what you might notice is a lot of examples of fallacy of accent are, as you would expect, in the spoken word. So can we find the fallacy of accent in writing as well? And it is a little bit harder because it does rely on emphasis on a word rather than the words themselves. But yes, indeed, you can. There are a couple of ways you can find the fallacy of accent in writing. One easy one that's often unintentional is just the simple fact that you take the spoken word and you put it in print, and when you read something in print, especially if it's sarcastic, if it's something that was meant to be dry humor, a sort of ironic joke, but now you can't hear the tone of voice of the speaker, you can't see their facial expressions, like maybe they were winking when they said it, I don't know, you can't see their body language. People can misunderstand sarcasm or ironic humor when they see it in writing. Sarcasm doesn't really translate to writing as well as it does to speech. Another good example, and this is the one that your book uses, as sort of a close relative of fallacy of accent, is quoting out of context or leaving things out of a quotation. You quote an author, you quote a speaker, and often when you do that, you don't need to quote everything they say. You can get the gist of what they're saying in a few words, and you leave other words out. Now, how do you signal that you're leaving something out of a quotation? Well, yeah, you use that punctuation with that dot, 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 those 3 dots that you find between words, the ellipsis, yes, the ellipsis. There is, in fact, as you see, there is, in fact, a $10 word for the dot, dot, dot that you find in a quotation. Now you know. When you see an ellipsis in a quotation, it means something was left out. And you often have to ask yourself what was left out and why. Why was it left out? And usually it's purely innocent. It's something that's irrelevant or boring, or it's just too many words and it doesn't change the meaning, so just leave it out. You don't need it. But sometimes the ellipsis is there to mislead. The person quoting the material wants you to think that it said something that it doesn't say. They wanted to change the meaning, and so they strategically left out some vital words. And this popped up in my life years ago in an argument I almost barely remember, but I was arguing with somebody. We were debating the Civil War and the presidency and the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, as one does. And this person was saying to me, well, don't you realize that Lincoln didn't really care about slavery? He didn't really want to emancipate the slaves? To which my response, at least in my head, was, well, 20 to 30 years of his speeches and writings argue against that. So I asked the person, well, what do you mean? And they respond with one of the most often misquoted things that Lincoln ever said from a letter in 1862 when he said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. So the person says, didn't Lincoln say if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it? To which the response is, yes, he did say that. By the way, that's part of a much larger quotation. What did that person leave out of the quotation from Old Abe? Well, what comes after the comma? So, and I have it here. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, comma. And then, if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So there's the context, and Lincoln goes on to explain, his primary purpose is to save the Union. It's a much different statement than what that person was trying to make Lincoln say. Plus, the person in that debate was leaving out the fact, so it's a quotation out of context, that Lincoln had in fact already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, and as you'll remember from your history lessons last year, was just waiting for a battlefield victory to issue it. So that's the fallacy of accent. Usually in speech, not as often in writing, but you can find it in writing too. And so looking for emphasis. How do you watch out for the fallacy of accent? Watch the emphasis. When people put emphasis on certain words and not others, sometimes that's for a specific reason. And especially if they're using weasel words, watch out for those weasel words. Watch out for those probablys and perhapses and relatively's. Or if someone says, well, I wouldn't say such and such. Well, why did they emphasize say? Well, because they're thinking it instead of saying it. Because remember, as truth tellers, as seekers of truth, one of the things we must be prioritizing is clear, direct language and saying what we mean and meaning what we say. So until next time, farewell, take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you at our next class discussion.